There is a particular quality to desert light that nobody who has not lived under it can adequately describe. Desert light is not brightness. It is the complete elimination of gray. Desert light at dusk gives way to a darkness so absolute that the stars appear not to emerge, but to have always been there, visible now only because the competing light has finally conceded. I arrived at Fort Huachuca in September of 1983, carrying what I had learned to carry. The desert received all of it without comment. The Army Intelligence Center and school occupied a complex of buildings. The original structure had been a World War II hospital, empty for years, with a particular weight of buildings that have been used for something serious. I recognized the quality of those buildings. It was the same quality as the Korea map in Maddox's office. The buildings had done something, and the doing had left a mark no renovation could cover. The MyBulk course covered the full range of military intelligence disciplines. It was comprehensive in the way introductions are broad enough to establish a map, silent about what lay beyond the map's edges. The silence about the territory beyond the edges was the most interesting part. The formal curriculum and actual work occupy adjacent but not identical spaces. The military intelligence community had more unspoken institutional knowledge than most. You learn to read what people are not saying. You learn the weight of a specific kind of silence. I shared a room with Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a man who had decided early that the most efficient path through any system was to become the person the system most wanted to produce. He had the rankings, the fitness scores, the correct opinions. He had looked at the map and was following it. He was the second person in my life to look at me with that particular expression, hearing an answer that didn't fit any category he had available. The first had been Maddox. The desert had no edges. You could walk into it, and it would continue past the range of vision in every direction, indifferent to maps or credentials. The Huachuca Mountains rose to the south and east, their ridgelines. In the particular sharp-edged clarity that desert light produces, every feature defined, every shadow precise. In Pittsburgh, the air between you and the distant thing was itself a visible substance, the industrial haze, the perpetual gray. In Arizona, the air was absent, clarifying. I ran the desert roads in the pre-dawn mornings. The desert received the running without comment. At West Point, the running had been observation. In Arizona, it was recalibration. Arizona offered no weight to share. The weight you carried into it was your own, unmediated, with nowhere to put it except back inside yourself. The formal curriculum was thorough and largely beside the point of what I was actually learning. The actual education happens in the spaces around the formal content. The first thing I was actually learning, the texture of the community, its language, its hierarchies, its unwritten codes, its particular relationship to information. The second thing, the specific shape of the gap between what the formal curriculum covered and what the work actually required. The shape of the gap tells you more than the curriculum. Maddox had been teaching me to read gaps for 2 years. Fort Huachuca's gap had a specific shape. I was spending the autumn of 1983 mapping. In April of 1983, a car bomb destroyed the American embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people, including 7 CIA officers. In October of the same year, a truck bomb killed 241 American service members at the Marine barracks in Beirut. I watched the institutional response to both events, not the emotional response, but the informational one. How an institution processes catastrophic intelligence failure tells you more than normal operations. Robert Ames, one of the CIA's most capable Middle East analysts, was among those killed. His loss was described in institutional language as irreplaceable. I recognized the pattern Maddox had described 2 years earlier. We do not fail to see. We fail to accept what we see. The recognition did not produce satisfaction. It produced the specific weight of understanding that arrives when a lesson taught in the abstract has a concrete cost the abstraction could not convey. 241 people, 63 people. The translation problem had a body count. The gap between receiving information and believing it had a body count. That was the autumn of 1983 at Fort Huachuca, where the abstract became concrete, where the gap acquired a weight it had not previously had. Marcus Webb was executing the curriculum with precision, building toward a clear outcome. I was building toward something I could not yet fully describe. He found this inefficient. The correct performance of an institutional curriculum is visible, the scores, the rankings. What I was doing in addition was invisible, because the invisible performance is the one the institution cannot evaluate. We had a conversation in January of 1984. He had revised his initial assessment of me. Focused, he said, but not on the curriculum. He could not determine what I was focused on instead. He said he was not sure whether I knew something he did not, or simply had a different relationship to uncertainty. I told him it was probably the second. Then I told him it might also be the first. He said if the first thing turned out to be true, he would be interested to know about it. Not immediately, but eventually. Marcus Webb eventually became Colonel Webb, the superior officer who forced my retirement in 2009. But in January of 1984, he was a lieutenant, asking his first careful question. The gap between that January conversation and the 2009 retirement spans the bulk of what this channel will document. The pattern is always visible in retrospect. The specific weight of each element only becomes legible after the pattern has completed itself. In March of 1984, I had been assigned to Arlington, Virginia, junior analyst position at the Defense Intelligence Agency's facility at Arlington Hall Station. Arlington Hall was not the Pentagon. It was a working facility, the lights on before dawn and after midnight, the parking lot, suggesting a population that had not gone home since the previous evening. The work was analytical, the reduction of collected intelligence into assessments, the translation of received information into something decision-makers could act on. The work of a junior analyst had a particular quality. It was almost entirely invisible. The assessment entered the system. The system closed around it. You produced the next assessment. The anonymity was protective. An analyst whose assessments were individually attributable could be influenced by that knowledge. The anonymity was also a form of isolation. I drove from Falls Church to Arlington Hall each morning, 20 minutes in moderate traffic, 40 in the rush. I used the commute as the river road, as the desert road's recalibration. The apartment in Falls Church was constructed in the early 1960s, functional, permanent, carrying no aspirations beyond the functional and the permanent. The Soviet military assessments were the daily substance of the work, not whether the Soviets had certain capabilities, but what they intended to do with them. The Cold War in 1984 was not the Cold War of abstract historical narrative. It was the Cold War of daily analytical effort, material collected at costs not specified in the material itself. The gap between what you could see and what you could understand was larger than the training had suggested. The collected material is always partial, always reflecting the limitations of collection. The institutional pressure toward false completeness decision-makers who need a complete picture will prefer an analyst who provides one, even if the completeness is illusory. That pressure was the most consistent feature of analytical work at Arlington Hall in 1984. It was in the gap. Maddox's teaching had specifically prepared me to resist it. The Soviet leadership in 1984 was genuinely uncertain about American intentions, processing public rhetoric as operational signal rather than political performance. The gap between the signal being sent and the signal being received had a history of producing catastrophic outcomes. In March of 1984, I met Catherine Walsh at a professional function with a social surface. She had been working at DIA for 4 years. She read rooms the way I read them. She had built the same walls I had built, from the same materials, for the same reasons, with the same result. When I recognized the quality in her, the recognition was not comfortable. Maddox had warned me, ciphers are most dangerous to each other because they reinforce. The recognition feels like intimacy. The reinforcement produces parallel isolation. We sat across a restaurant table in Washington in March of 1984 and talked about our fathers, about the weight military families carry, about the silence of households where the most important information never gets spoken. She had grown up reading absence. I had grown up reading absence. The fluency felt, at the time, like the most genuine communication I had experienced since Maddox named what I was. I did not understand, in March of 1984, that fluency in reading absence is not the same thing as the ability to be present. That would take 7 years and a kitchen at 3 in the morning. The months between March and August had the texture of the pre-decision interval, everything happening in relation to a decision not yet made but whose approach was felt. Patience in the intelligence context is not waiting. It is observation conducted over an extended interval, what changes and what doesn't, what the shape of the waiting reveals. The Soviet analytical picture in the spring of 1984, the SDI announcement, the Pershing deployments. The evil empire rhetoric was producing a Soviet response that the community was reading with specific unease. The pattern. The Soviet leadership was genuinely frightened about American intentions. The American leadership did not appear to fully appreciate how frightened. The gap between those two perceptions was the kind that had a history of catastrophic outcomes. I was producing assessments on Soviet military doctrine, one component of a larger picture I could not see in its entirety. What I could see was my component. What I could observe from the institutional response was the pattern still being mapped. The contact came on a Tuesday afternoon in August. The phrasing Maddox had told me to expect was used. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. The divergence was not dramatic. A door opening slightly further than it had previously been open. A question about whether I was willing to step through. The same answer, yes. The price was the same. It always was. The formal record from August of 1984 onward reflects assignments accurate in broad outlines and incomplete in specific content. What it does not contain is what those assignments actually involved. Fort Huachuca, 1983. The formal entry point. The desert that burned away the gray. The barracks conversation with a lieutenant who would eventually end my career. Arlington Hall, 1984. The coffee shop, contact. The door opened. The formation, complete. The desert received everything I arrived with and held it without comment, in the specific patience of a system large enough to be indifferent to small additions. The formation is complete. The operational years begin here. What it costs to translate information accurately when the accuracy has consequences for people not in the room where the translation happens, that understanding is coming. There was a specific quality to the work of being a junior analyst at Arlington Hall that no description had prepared me for. The work was almost entirely invisible. Not classified in the sense of being hidden, but invisible in the more fundamental sense of being consumed by the system without any visible acknowledgement that the consumption had occurred. You produced an assessment. The assessment entered a distribution chain. Somewhere it was read, or not read, or acted on, or filed, or contradicted. You did not know which. The work entered the system, and the system closed around it. The anonymity was protective. An analyst whose assessments were individually attributable could be influenced by that knowledge. The anonymity was also, in the specific way of every protective structure, a form of isolation. I drove from Falls Church each morning. The apartment built in the early 1960s, functional, permanent, carrying no aspirations beyond those. The commute used the way the river road had been used. Recalibration. Heat processing in the spring of 1984 was running on 2 parallel tracks I had not yet found a way to integrate. The first, the work at Arlington Hall. The second, Catherine. I had met Catherine Walsh in March at a professional function with a social service. She had been at DIA 4 years. She read rooms the way I read them. She had built the same walls. I had met Catherine Walsh in March at a professional function with a social surface. She had been at DIA 4 years. She read rooms the way I read them. She had built the same walls. Maddox had warned me in 1982, ciphers are most dangerous to each other because they reinforce. The recognition feels like intimacy. The reinforcement produces parallel isolation. In March of 1984, I had that only as filed information, not yet as warning. The dinner lasted 3 hours. We talked about our fathers, about military family weight, about households where the most important information never gets spoken. She had grown up reading absence. So had I. The fluency felt, at the time, like the most genuine communication since Maddox named what I was. I did not understand that fluency in reading absence is not the same as the ability to be present. That understanding that fluency and presence are not the same would take 7 years and a kitchen at 3 in the morning. The months between March and August had the texture of the pre-decision interval, everything happening in relation to a decision not yet made, but whose approach was felt. Patience in the intelligence context is not waiting. It is observation conducted over an extended interval, what the shape of the waiting reveals about what is being waited for. The Soviet analytical picture in spring and summer, 1984, the SDI announcement, the Pershing deployments. The evil empire rhetoric was producing a Soviet response the analytical community read with specific unease. The Soviet leadership was genuinely frightened about American intentions in a way the American leadership did not fully appreciate. The gap between those two perceptions was the kind that had a history of catastrophic outcomes. I was producing assessments on Soviet military doctrine, one component of a larger picture I could not see in its entirety. The institutional pressure toward false completeness was the most consistent feature of the work. The contact came on a Tuesday afternoon in August. The phrasing Maddox had told me to expect was used. The conversation lasted 45 minutes in a coffee shop 2 blocks from Arlington Hall. The formal trajectory diverged, quietly and without announcement, into something else. A door opening slightly further. A question about whether I was willing to step through. The same answer. The same price. The formal record, from August 1984 onward, reflects assignments, accurate in broad outlines and incomplete in specific content. What it does not contain is what those assignments actually involved. The formal record, when it is eventually read by someone with sufficient clearance and sufficient patience, tells a story of competent progression. Junior Analyst DIA, Arlington Hall Station, March 1984 through December 1984. Reassigned January 1985. The reassignment entry carries a unit designation that exists in the records and a location that is accurate, and a role description that is 4 words long and accurate in the way that 4-word descriptions of complex, operational roles are accurate, which is to say, entirely truthful about the category and entirely silent about the content. I have looked at that entry in my own file. I have looked at it the way you look at a word you have used so many times. It has lost its surface meaning and reveals only its structure. The structure of a 4-word role description in a classified personnel file is the structure of a door. It tells you a door exists. It does not tell you what is on the other side. What was on the other side was the work that this channel exists to describe. Not the formal work, the assessments, the briefings, the analytical products that moved through distribution chains and closed behind them. The other work. The work that Maddox had been pointing at for 2 years, and that the contact in the coffee shop in August had confirmed existed, and that my answer had committed me to. I want to describe it carefully. Not because the description is easy, it is not, but because the careful description is the only honest one available to me at this distance. The careless description would be more dramatic. It would involve words that carry the weight of their genre: covert, clandestine, asset, operation. Those words are accurate in a technical sense and misleading in a practical one, because they suggest a kind of work that is defined by its most visible features: the danger, the secrecy, the operational tempo, when the work is actually defined by something much less visible and much more fundamental. The work is defined by the translation problem. Maddox named it in a Thursday session in 1981. He said, "The discipline is in the translation. How do you translate what you receive into something useful without coloring it with what you want it to mean?" I had been practicing the answer to that question at every level of my formation on Maple Street, watching a father who was not there; in Maddox's classroom, watching the man rather than the idea; at Camp Buckner, reading the opposing force before it moved; at Arlington Hall, producing assessments in a system that preferred false completeness to honest uncertainty. All of that had been preparation for the version of the translation problem that began in January of 1985, the version that had a face. I will not describe the face. Not because I am legally prevented from doing so in all of its specifics, but because describing the face before describing what the face meant would be the same error that the intelligence failure literature documents over and over: the presentation of the dramatic specific before the context that makes the specific legible. You need the context first. The face comes later, in the episodes that follow this one. What I will say here, at the end of this formation chapter, is this: the translation problem at the operational level is not a problem of information processing. It is a problem of weight management. At the analytical level, the information you process is abstract in the sense that it represents things, capabilities, intentions, patterns, but the things themselves are at a distance. The Soviet military doctrine assessments I was producing at Arlington Hall in 1984 were connected to real decisions and real consequences, but the connection ran through several institutional layers and a distribution chain and a decision-making process that insulated the analytical production from its outcomes. That insulation is structural. It is designed. It exists because analytical work requires a degree of detachment that operational proximity destroys. At the operational level, the insulation is gone. The translation problem at the operational level means translating information whose weight you can feel directly, information about people who are present or recently present, or whose absence is itself the information, into assessments that will determine actions whose consequences you will also be positioned to observe directly. The loop is closed. The analytical remove is removed. And what you are left with is the weight of knowing and the weight of translating and the weight of the consequence, all in the same room, all at the same time, with no institutional architecture between them. Maddox had described this in February of 1981. He had said, "What a person who wants to be useful to this work must be willing to sacrifice." At 19, I had understood the sentence. I had not understood what willing means about a sacrifice that has not yet been required. Willing is an attitude. Sacrifice is an event. The attitude and the event are separated by everything that happens between them. In January of 1985, the event began. I will describe it in the episodes that follow. I will describe it in the order it occurred, because the order is the only context that makes the individual elements legible, and because the order is what I committed to when I agreed to do this. The Gray Operative exists to document 31 years of work in sequence, from the formation to the ending, without the editorial comfort of selecting only the elements that make the whole coherent. The whole is not entirely coherent. That is the honest version. What I can tell you here, in the last passage of the formation chapter, is that the weight I carried out of the coffee shop in August of 1984 was different from any weight I had carried before it. Not heavier in the simple sense. The physical weight of information does not increase as its significance increases, but different in a specific way that I have spent 31 years attempting to describe accurately and have not yet fully managed. The closest I can come is this. Every weight I had carried before August of 1984 was weight I could put down when I chose to. The letter to my father, the assessments at Arlington Hall, the pattern recognition at Camp Buckner. All of it was weight I carried by choice, in the sense that the carrying was always a decision I was making to continue, to accept, to say yes. The decision was renewable. The weight was renewable. You could set it down and pick it back up, and it would be approximately the same weight each time. The weight I acquired in August of 1984 was not renewable. It did not remain the same weight between instances of carrying. It accumulated. Every element added to it changed the weight of everything that had come before. The way each word in a sentence changes the weight of every word that preceded it. Once the sentence is complete and you can read its full shape, by December of 1984, I had been carrying it for 4 months. By December of 1986, I had been carrying it for 2 years, and it had a specific weight that the December 1984 version could not have predicted. By the later chapters of this account, the ones that involve Yusuf al-Rashid and the decision I made in 2003 that I have not yet described, and that Colonel Webb described in 2009 as the reason for the retirement, the weight was what it was, and I was what it had made me. And both of those things were irreversible in the specific way of the things you carry long enough that they stop being things you carry and start being things you are. That is the formation. The Pittsburgh boy who read steel mills, the way Maddox read cadets, the West Point plebe who watched the man instead of the idea, the yearling who read the opposing force at Camp Buckner before it moved, the junior analyst who resisted the institutional pressure toward false completeness at Arlington Hall, the lieutenant who said yes in a coffee shop in August of 1984 to a door whose other side he could not yet fully see. All of that produced something. Maddox named it in 1980. Garrett confirmed it from a different angle in 1981. Ames named a different dimension of it in the summer of 1981. The desert clarified it by removing every filter. Arlington Hall tested it against the institutional pressure that is the daily condition of analytical work. The coffee shop contact confirmed that what had been produced was what had been intended, a cipher, a pattern reader, a person who could receive without broadcasting, translate without distorting, carry without putting down. The formation is complete. Next time, January 1985. The first operational assignment. The first face attached to the translation problem. And the beginning of the weight that does not reduce. The specific quality of the work in the months between the coffee shop contact and the January reassignment was the quality of the interval between a decision and its implementation. The decision had been made. The implementation had not yet begun. Unquote. The interval was occupied by the ordinary work of the Arlington Hall analytical position, the Soviet doctrine assessments, the distribution chain, the institutional pressure toward false completeness. But the ordinary work had acquired a different relationship to the time it occupied. It was no longer the main thing. It was the container. The main thing was what was coming, and the coming of it was felt in the way that all significant approaches are felt before they arrive, not as anxiety, not as anticipation exactly, but as a kind of heightened registration of the present moment's temporary quality. Everything I did between August and December of 1984 had the particular clarity of things done in the knowledge that they are ending. I do not mean this in a dramatic sense. The Arlington Hall position was not ending dramatically. It was transitioning in the way that careers in the intelligence community transition, without announcement, without ceremony, with only a reassignment entry in a personnel file that describes the transition in 4 words and says nothing about what the transition means. The clarity came from the knowledge of transition, not from any dramatic quality in the transition itself. What I was registering in those months was the texture of the last period of a particular kind of work before a different kind of work began. I was registering it because I had been trained to register things not selectively, not only the things that seemed important, but everything. In the understanding that the importance of a specific thing is often not apparent until significantly later, when the larger pattern it belongs to has become legible. So I registered the Arlington Hall, autumn of 1984 inches full. The quality of the light through the old windows of the former girls' school, as October moved toward November. The specific rhythm of the morning commute from Falls Church, which had by then settled into the automatic quality of a repeated route no longer requiring navigation, occupying only the background processing capacity, and leaving the foreground available for whatever the current interval of recalibration required. Catherine was part of the autumn of 1984 inches, a way that I have thought about carefully and still cannot fully characterize. We had continued seeing each other after the March dinner. We had continued in the way that two people continue when both of them are doing work they cannot fully discuss, and both of them have built the same walls for the same reasons, which is to say, with considerable warmth and considerable structural distance simultaneously, and with the specific confusion that results from mistaking the warmth for the absence of the distance. She knew, in the way that people at her clearance level knew things about the trajectories of people at my clearance level, that a reassignment was approaching. She did not ask about it directly. I did not offer information directly. We talked about the approach of it indirectly, in the language of two people who have learned to communicate through indirection and who are good at it, and who do not yet understand that being good at communicating through indirection is not the same as communicating on an evening. In November of 1984, she said something that I have returned to more times than I can count in the 31 years since. We were in the apartment in Falls Church after dinner, the television on at low volume in the way it is on when it is providing background rather than content, and she said, without looking at me, that she thought I was the most present, absent person she had ever known. I asked her what she meant. She said she meant that I was always entirely there. My attention was never elsewhere. I was never distracted. I registered everything, and that simultaneously the registration was all there was. She was not in the registration. She was information I was processing. I did not know what to do with that. Not because it was wrong, it was accurate, in a way that the most accurate things are accurate, which is to say, uncomfortably and without mitigation, but because I did not have a response that was not itself a performance of the quality she was describing. Any answer I gave would be a cipher's answer. Receiving, filing, translating, not generating. I said I understood what she meant. She said she knew I did. That was precisely the problem. We sat in the Falls Church apartment for another hour, with the television on at low volume and the November darkness outside the window, and the specific quality of a conversation that has said the most important thing and has no natural successor. I understood everything she had said. I could not do anything with the understanding that was not itself a demonstration of its accuracy. Maddox had warned me in February of 1981, "You will be a cipher in your own kitchen on a Sunday morning." He had been describing the professional cost. He had not emphasized the earlier cost, the cost in the approaches. The cost in the November evenings before the operational years had even properly begun. The reassignment came in January. Falls Church, to a different address that I will not specify. The analytical work of a different kind that I will describe in the episodes that follow. Catherine remained at Arlington Hall in her position. We continued seeing each other through 1985 and 1986, and into the years after that, in the way that two careful people continue when both of them know that something fundamental has been named, and neither of them can change it. The 7 years ran their course. The kitchen at 3 a.m. arrived in the way that Maddox had said it would arrive. The silence had the quality of a decision made. I had watched it coming. I had logged it. I had not done the one thing that would have stopped it, because the one thing that would have stopped it would have required me to be something other than what I was. That is what the formation produced. That is what the coffee shop contact accepted. That is the thing I carried out of August of 1984 that did not reduce the gray operative. Every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was.